In addition, among other things, excerpt from the official 697th contact interview of 17/18 of December 2017. Ysrjr says, Saturday, the 17th of February 1945. At the same time, when the Soviet Union is coming to an end and a new Russia will emerge, a union dictatorship, note, will emerge in Europe. Ptaah, Europa Union's dictatorship, and bind many European countries to themselves, whose leaders and their populations will become inconsiderate, gullible, foolish and trustingly involved in the insidious as well as lyingly peaceful, liberal and unifying union dictatorship. But after years, however, the truth will be that everything will only be aligned deception, breaking the true essence of the union dictatorship and creating internal strife, when the leaders and peoples will rise up and rebel against the subjugating machinations of the union dictatorships, whereby in some cases expulsions from that dictatorship will be taken into consideration. And it will also be by the unreasonableness of certain brief, thinking, inexperienced, unwise, uncritical and unreasonable governors, and with regard to the assessment of facts of incompetent parts of the Swiss population, that they too will fall into the clutches of the Union's dictatorship, and that they will constantly and ever more oppress and force Switzerland to become more and more involved in treaties in favor of the Union's dictatorship. This will drive Switzerland more and more maliciously and with coercive rules into the dictatorship's rulers' hands, whereby Switzerland and its population will lose many freedoms, which will force it to act only in accordance with the laws, directives and contractual regulations of the Union's dictatorship, and will ultimately call neutrality into question. And it will be the case that responsible Swiss governors, who will negotiate with the rulers of this Union dictatorship, will contractually bow irresponsibly to the impoverished and dictatorial demands and thus drive their own homeland and the population more and more towards membership with the Union dictatorship. Only if the people of Switzerland can it be prevented from becoming a vassal state of this Union dictatorship by means of referendums can it be prevented that Switzerland becomes a vassal state of this Union dictatorship. In this way, as in the whole world, an unpeaceful state of affairs will develop between this dictatorship and Switzerland, just as there will be no real peace in the whole world. Everything will go on as it has been since time immemorial and will take on much worse forms, because many people in this world will become inexorable, and the longer, the more terrible, cruel, incoherent and indifferent to each other, which will inevitably result from the world's growing population, which is growing at an ever faster rate, creating enormous problems of many kinds that can no longer be controlled. It will also give rise to brutality, unscrupulousness and widespread violence, murder and manslaughter, ever-increasing crime and rampant crime, as well as unrest and violence in families. In the future, very malicious religious aberrations will also arise in the future, as well as new bad racial hatred and revenge campaigns against those of other faiths, whereby bloodthirsty terrorist organizations worldwide will brutally torture and murder hundreds of thousands of people. But with all these kinds of things will not be enough, because everything will increase the longer, the more and far into the third millennium and become increasingly malicious. And to the exuberance of all this and many more like-minded Earth's human depravity will be joined by the addiction to money and profit, which will become utterly uncontrollable. This will include the use of lethal poisons that are released into the natural system to promote food growth and larger harvests, to kill plant pests and to inhibit or destroy weed species in their growth. But in every respect everything related will be for profit. However, many useful and even vital insects, as well as all kinds of mammals and other organisms important for the function of the natural system as well as plants are poisoned, killed and exterminated, as well as humans will fall ill, suffer and die as a result of the poisons, because all the toxins released into the natural system are found in the food plants, the soil, many organisms, as well as in the waterways. Excerpt from the official 692nd contact interview on the 29th of October 2017 to Ysrjr, prediction of great-great-grandfather Hilak, from 1446 by Emmanuel, Ysrjr. The life of people in the world decays over thousands of years into the distant future of the modern age and very long afterwards, through delusional faith in deities and the like, turning negative into a miserable, unpleasant and decaying life in false faith, slavery rotten by faith. The result is a serious captivity in a delusion that leads for thousands of years to discontent and terrible wars and always leads to new perdition. Faith-related delusions of the senses, delusions, 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 delusions and deceptions, mystifications, illusions and pretenses of phantasmagoria will belong to the order of all the coming times and will in many cases claim thousands of lives and will again and again destroy large parts of the world and its nature through wars, etc., destroying many thousands of lives. And the origin of this misfortune will be in around 200 years with the emergence of the coming Ysrjr. Note. Ptaah, monotheistically decayed tribe in Canaan, later Syria, actual origin of Judaism, the first worldwide delusion started, which will be carried far into the distant future by wars, hatred, envy, revenge and lies and deception for thousands of years. This first delusional belief, which in the distant future will be called creed, Ptaah, religion, will bring misery, envy, misery, suffering, delusional hatred and destruction between all peoples of the world for thousands of years. The association of believers, note, Ptaah, faith community, faith connection, faith association, which is being set in motion by the first one. The actual origin for the biggest faiths of the world will emerge. From this origin, another delusional confederation will emerge in the east of the world in another 700 years or so, which will spread bloodshed and hatred throughout the world over time. A further 500 years or so after that, a prophesier, Emmanuel, of the old doctrine of the prophets will appear, but his doctrine will be falsified, abused and used to derive a new, globally extremely slanderous, perishable, hateful, dangerous, fatally impregnated and destructive new delusion. This will lead over 2 millennia to worldwide wars, war atrocities, murder, hate, persecution and the immense destruction of countless human works, nature and its creatures. There will also be an unmistakable number of people involved, who will multiply like grasshoppers and invent and carry out machinations, whose malignant effects will destroy large parts of the planet and nature, so that much of the natural life will die out forever. But about 500 years after the publication of the Ysrjr of the doctrine of the prophets, a new proclaimer, note, Ptaah, Muhammad, come into being in the revival of the same doctrine to eradicate all that is false and reprehensible. But what malicious and delusional believers and those who defame the doctrine will have made slandering the doctrine of the prophet of the previous denouncer. But also the teachings of this new skulder will be falsified in an extremely malicious way and will lead to wars, hatred, slander and countless deaths, as well as to horror, to extensively deadly violence, actions, note, to tyranny, despotism, dictatorship, reign of terror, totalitarian systems, absolutist rule and terrorism, which will lead to riots, unrest, violence, riots, street fighting, riots and assaults. Therefore, through clarity and reason, the people of modern times must learn to understand their situation leading them into the abyss and free themselves from their false beliefs, find their way to themselves, become themselves and consciously learn to bear their own responsibility. It should therefore be said to all of humanity that they have to leave their faith prison and their belief mania, because otherwise large masses will be led astray by their faith in God, and a multitude of millions will be tortured and murdered by degenerative persecutions of faith if the sun cross, note, is destroyed. To a sun wheel, swastika, as a malicious sign announces the onset of horror and releases the energy of the tiniest, note. To a nuclear fission, abuses it and becomes a devastating messenger of death. And if it happens, then it is also announced that all horrors will become more and more frequent, as a result of which many sufferings will arise, and only a small part of the non-belief reason will be able to recognize and understand the truth. And only a small part of the non-belief reason will be able to recognize and understand the truth, whereby only a few will be wise enough to knowingly find their true happiness. Everything around man will collapse and disappear, and nothing of the achievements of civilization will survive, for the perversity of men will destroy everything, for it will shake the whole earth, and ultimately no traces of erroneous cults will survive. The great mass of many billions of people will degenerate under the yoke of ignorance and God's faith and become alien to real life in a creative way and degenerate in every conceivable way. Heavy earthquakes will also change the face of the Earth's world as mechanical natural events, tremendous violent storms and unexpected fires. But it will not be listened to the warnings, nor to the old teaching of the prophets, which the new preacher of the modern age will bring, and which will have the goal of awakening and sensitizing people's minds and reason, in order to enable them to be able themselves to learn from their mistakes and the delusion of their religious faith, and from its follies as well as from all their evil acts, deeds and crimes of all kinds. Nevertheless, they should be taught by the new preacher and learn to understand that they alone are responsible for all their actions and behavior, just as other intelligent forms of life in the universe are. People should and must strive to be in harmony with the currents of nature and the universe, and thus with creation and all its existence, and not refuse to walk with the creative stream, so as not to miss out on the benefits of the good conditions offered to them by the creation, pretending that can be developed higher and higher by the intelligence and power of man himself. But they must develop the evolution of their consciousness, so that they do not remain in their mind and reason, so that they do not have to wait millions of years until a foreign power helps them to an ascending wave of mind and reason. The Earth and the whole solar system, as well as the universe as a whole, was not created by a cheap and non-existent deity, but as the only creation through an immense distribution of natural coherence of creative, natural impulses, and brought into a further developing direction. These creative and natural impulses, which also have an effect on people, are called love for understanding in the human sense, but are disregarded by countless people, regarded as sentimentalism and, despite their great power, judged to be ridiculous. In fact and truth, these impulses called love are, however, the greatest of all the forces that exist in man, besides which money and power are nothing but void values, even if men are decisively dependent on them for the course and maintenance of their lives. But in the future, however, people would have to be particularly flooded with love and serve it, because otherwise their lives and consciousness will be tortured and damaged by unimaginable suffering, difficulties and inhuman acts and terror, whereby the mental order, thoughts and aspirations and their behavior will then become evil, criminal, iniquitous, reprehensible, primitive and reckless. So then the terrifying forms of prophecies of the ancient prophets will be fulfilled, which refer to the coming epoch, which will soon begin and be fulfilled, but will continue from the sign of the sun cross in a vicious and frightening way, and will continue to move into the future. There will also be times of great flooding over the world, and there will be water where the earth is, and there will be water where there will be water. Hurricanes, gigantic fires and earthquakes will rain and sweep everything away, as will flow with blood through horror, wars, murders, revolutions, tyranny, violence, dictatorship, totalitarianism, tyranny, despotism, unlimited violence and crime. Terrible explosions will be heard in many places around the world as a result of explosions and terrorist attacks, which will lead to fear, dismay, fear and terror in many places and in many countries. And in many cases the false and mad faith in God will be guilty for this, and it will always be a man's delusion, but never an answer or a demand of a God invented by man. On the contrary, however, nature will demand retribution for the crimes committed and perpetrated against it and against the earth by humanity, which is overwhelmed in its multitude. People are advised to practice peace, live in peace and rule the world in peace before the time of suffering and terror comes, for it has been written since time immemorial that not a single hair of the righteous will be bent. So let the righteous men not be discouraged, but simply follow the path of learning for the personal further development of their consciousness, as the old true prophets have taught it, and as in the modern times the new preacher will teach it, and his teaching will also be carried out into the universe. People have to study his teaching and learn how the universe and thus creation work, because it is necessary for them to learn to understand the world and creation as nature and universe very quickly and to merge with it in knowledge. In this way, people are predestined to learn to live in a way that is in keeping with nature and creation, just as each individual is capable of striving for and living according to the laws of creation. But everyone has to shape himself like a new continent and emerge from the huge sea like an island, spreading out in his love and knowledge to the best of his own ability. In modern times, the new preacher will be the founder of a new civilization, note to a grouping, association, who will also be called community and will unswervingly work for the good and right and for the old teaching of the prophets, note to a teaching of truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of life. Through a new way it will spread the old teaching of the prophets and represent them to people all over the world. In time, mankind on earth will thus form a large family, which will ultimately be like a large and extensive body. In the new civilization, note to a grouping, community, association, love will manifest itself in a way that the preachers will simply and unifyingly exemplify. But unfortunately, the earth will remain a planet of struggle, trouble, misery and distress, even though in modern times the teachings of the new shepherd will gradually be spread all over the world through new modern possibilities and ways. The forces of evil and darkness will feel well pressured and slowly retreat, but the earth and its humanity will never be finally freed from them. Many people following the teachings of the scholar will follow a new, better and clear path. A path of the new life that leads to the development of consciousness, to reason, to inner peace, to inner freedom and joy of life and to the true man. But others, the unrighteous and degenerate, in their senseless pride and unrighteousness, will carry on with their lives, condemn all creativeness and be inconsiderate. Conclusion. But at last they will have to learn to understand that their old way of life is completely wrong and no longer compatible with the new world, which will be created by the new doctrine and will awaken a new culture and civilization. It will then only be a question of time when the light of truth, goodness and justice will watch and triumph. Religions will lose their strength and will have to give truth its traditional place when the common basis of all systems of God's faith collapses. As a result, bad people will slowly give up the intensity of their evil deeds and turn to the peacefulness of truth and their fellow human beings. But many of them will also harass and hate the new preacher of the modern age, and they will cruelly injure his teaching efforts in his honor with reluctant, hostile verbal abuse and false accusations, words of lies and vain slander conceived in anger. And shame is perpetrated on his reputation and disgraceful intrigues. Note to says, injustices, assassinations, assaults, are committed against him. So also will be deliberately tried by hateful faith followers, with many new tools of modern times. Note to in the face of this, it is a duty to destroy his obligation and his work in a despicable and cunning way. But all those who attack will do harm to themselves, for their lives will be unhappy, and they will one day be hated by fellow human beings themselves, because they will not accept the new life with regard to the old teaching of the prophets, as a result of which they will already pass away in their lives like lazy, harmful fruits. But it will also be on earth that certain continents will sink and others will appear, because not only people but also the face of the world will change completely, and there will be many dangers in the thousands of years to come, which humanity is not yet aware of and which will bring them much suffering, misery, wars, damage and destruction. Many people will also continue for a long time to pursue dishonorable, unworthy, dangerous and dangerous goals that pose great dangers to all of humanity, but which will ultimately be doomed to failure. And this will be so, while others who respectfully learn and obey the teachings of the new man of the modern age will be honorable with their lives and with all things. Thanks to the teaching of the ancient prophets, the earth will one day become a blessed planet, but until then mankind will be struck by a great deal of suffering, misery and distress, and its consciousness will not yet be awakened. So it will take centuries and millennia before everything is fulfilled in such a way that the teaching of the ancient prophets becomes the true teaching of life for all mankind. So she still has to prepare herself for big and difficult tests and have to master them, because she cannot avoid them and has to learn to control them, whether she wants to or not. Otherwise she will one day perish. Billy says, gigantic, and this was predicted about 3,500 years ago by your great-great-grandfather Hilak. He looked very far into the future. Tua says, he has looked to the future. Billy says, so no probability calculations, but looking to the future.